But we all know this wasn't the case, because of what happened next. And this, according to the Bible, is when Mary Magdalene takes center stage. After his death, Jesus' body was placed in a rock tomb. We're told that Mary Magdalene was one of the women who kept vigil. It's not hard to imagine how she must have felt when she went to anoint the body of her Messiah. It was customary at this time for Jewish women to prepare bodies for burial. Corpses were considered unclean, and so it was always a woman's task to handle them. Mary is already in deep mourning. She has witnessed Jesus' horrific execution, perhaps at some risk to herself. But according to the Bible, when she goes to the tomb, Jesus' body is no longer there. The fullest account of Mary's role after discovering the empty tomb is in the Gospel of John. She's in a state of shock and runs to where the disciples are gathered to tell them the news.
When she reports to the disciples, she is not believed. And I think that just reflects perfectly their attitude about a woman witness. They're just thinking, well, she's hysterical or something, and so we needn't believe this.
It is quite understandable why the disciples refused to believe Mary. She was a woman, and I'd go on to say a woman who had until recently been considered stark raving mad.
Because they don't believe her, Peter and another unnamed disciple return with her to the tomb to see for themselves. Peter reacts to the sight of the discarded burial cloth with anger and dismay. But the other disciple understands what has happened and concludes that Jesus must have risen from the dead. The two of them leave without a backward glance at Mary. Then something even more extraordinary happens. It is Mary Magdalene's biggest moment. Mary is alone when someone asks her why she's crying. She believes it's the gardener and says, "They have taken my Lord's body, and I do not know where he is." The figure says her name, and then she sees Jesus. She is overwhelmed and says, "Master?" and goes forward to reach out to him. But he stops her. He says, "Don't touch me." Instead, she must go to the others and tell them that he has risen from the dead. It's an awesome moment. Jesus stands before her, yet he's beyond her reach. It cannot be said if Jesus really stood before her, resurrected, or if Mary simply believed she had seen him. But either way, in this one moment, Mary's experience took the Christian movement in an important new direction.
A new concept developed which had nothing to do with what Jesus himself was preaching, and this is the concept that Jesus didn't die. Or, in other words, he did die, but he was raised from the dead because he was God's son. which suggests, of course, that there's no reason for the movement to disintegrate. It is not a failure, it is in fact a great success. This idea is the idea of Mary Magdalene.
Jesus' resurrection was the turning point for Christianity. This was when it changed from a small movement to a whole new religion, and Mary Magdalene was a key figure in this event. You might think then that at the very least Mary would be recognised as an apostle, one of the early missionaries who founded the religion, as she seems to meet all the criteria set out in the Bible.
And if we look at the Gospel of Luke, it states very clearly that the qualification for becoming an apostle was to have been with Jesus during his ministry, to have been a witness to the death and resurrection, and to be able to then go out and teach the true gospel which he gave. Mary Magdalene fills that role perfectly.
Yet that's a role the Bible never gives to her. Nowhere in the New Testament is Mary Magdalene named as an apostle. To find out why, we have to return to another long-lost apocryphal text. In a Cairo bazaar in 1896, a German scholar happened to come across a curious papyrus book. It was bound in leather and written in Coptic, the ancient language of early Christian Egypt. But the origin of this document was very mysterious.
Unfortunately, we know almost nothing about the discovery of the manuscript. The story that was told at the time is that it came from Akhmim in Upper Egypt, and something was said about its having been found in a niche in a wall.
The town of Akhmim was home to a persecuted Christian community in the early centuries, so the document might have been carefully hidden by a martyr, heretic or monk. On closer examination, the text revealed itself as something truly remarkable. It was the Gospel of Mary. Like the books found at Nag Hammadi, the Gospel according to Mary Magdalene is also considered an apocryphal text. The story it contains begins sometime after the resurrection. The disciples have just had a vision of Jesus.
Jesus encouraged the disciples to go out and preach his teachings to the world, but they're afraid to do so because he was killed for it, and they say if they killed him, they're going to kill us too. And it's Mary, and that's Mary Magdalene, that's quite clear, who steps forward and says, don't be worried, he promised he would be with us, he'll protect us.
She's the one who can step in and remain calm and not be frightened. And it says she turns their hearts toward the good. And they begin to discuss the words of the Savior.
In books like the Gospel of Philip, Mary was presented as a symbol of wisdom. But in the Gospel of Mary, she is the one in charge, telling the disciples about Jesus' teachings. Previously, we were merely told that she was wise. In this Gospel, we can see it for ourselves.
Now, at this point, Peter asks Mary to tell them some things that she might have heard, but which the other disciples haven't. And she says, I will tell you what has been hidden from you. And so she talks about a vision she had of Jesus and a conversation that she had with him.
As the Gospel tells it, Mary then relates the details of this conversation, which is to do with spiritual development and the soul's lifelong battle with evil.
But at this point, controversy arises. And Andrew steps in and he says, well, I don't know what the rest of you think, but these things seem very strange to me, and it seems that she's telling us teachings that are different from the Savior.
This is clearly a point of contention. At least one disciple, and perhaps more, doubt the truth of what Mary says. And there is worse to come.
مريم
Peter then chimes in, and he says, are we supposed to now all turn around and listen to her? Would Jesus have spoken privately with a woman rather than openly to us? Did he prefer her to us?
Matthew defends Mary and quells Peter's attack on her. In the text, Peter's problem is that Jesus selected Mary above the other disciples to interpret his teachings. Peter sees Mary as a rival for the leadership of the group itself.
She's portrayed as the disciple who really gets it, if you will, who really understands what's going on and understands his teaching.
The text makes it clear that what qualifies her to lead the group is her spiritual maturity.
The irony is that most people think of Peter as the rock upon which the church was established. He is, the main or major disciple figure, and Mary Magdalene is, at best, a kind of side figure in the cast of characters.
The Gospel of Mary is such a challenge to our view of Mary Magdalene that we have to be sure it's authentic. After all, no one really knows where it came from, and unlike other early Christian writings, there was no reference to it before it was found.
What's fascinating about the discovery of the Gospel of Mary is we didn't even know it existed. We didn't even have the title itself.
So how do we know that it is an authentic ancient document and not a forgery? It would help to know its age. Coptic text is difficult to date accurately, but amazingly, 2 other fragments of the Gospel were found in a rubbish heap, and these were written in Greek, which made dating much easier.
The Greek fragments can be dated on the basis of their handwriting. That suggests that the Gospel of Mary was probably composed already in the early part of the 3rd century, or perhaps already in the 2nd century.
And, as a leading Coptic expert, Stephen Emmel believes it must be authentic.
For someone to have purposely fabricated these manuscripts in modern times would require a kind of genius that I think just doesn't exist. This is someone who would have to be able to manufacture papyrus using techniques that have been lost for more than 1,000 years. They'd have to have had a knowledge of Coptic that goes far beyond anything that the greatest specialists in Coptic have ever had. They would have had to have conceived of an entire world that no one else knows anything about in every detail. It's not credible that someone could create such a fabrication.
If the Gospel of Mary is genuine, it might provide the real reason that Mary Magdalene vanished from the Bible. Controversially, it offers a very different view of the disciples.
One of the absolutely fascinating things about the Gospel of Mary is it really asks us to rethink that story about Christian history. Did all the disciples get it? Did they really understand and preach the truth? Now, this is very radical and perhaps, I think heretical.
And perhaps the Gospel of Mary was just too radical. It presents Mary as a teacher and spiritual guide to the other disciples. She's not just a disciple, she's the apostle to the apostles. And yet, we only know Mary Magdalene as a prostitute. So how was her reputation so drastically distorted? The authorship of the Gospel of Mary holds a clue. Mary didn't write the Gospel herself. She had been dead for a long time. But experts now have an idea who did.
I would guess that it was a woman. I think one has to assume that it was written by someone who belonged to a Christian community in which women had a prominent role, but where that role was being disputed.
The Gospel of Mary grew out of the way that the first Christians came together, and the makeup of these groups was shaped by where they met.
The early churches met in houses, and attracted people who were friends and so forth, eating together, was one of the primary practices of these communities.
And as houses were the domain of women, they naturally played a prominent part within these communities.
Women played all kinds of roles as apostles, teachers, heads of house churches, so on and so forth. We see, for example, from Paul's letter to Corinth, that there were women prophets within the Christian community.
But in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, differences were already emerging between groups led by men and groups led by women.
Within some groups of early Christianity, Mary Magdalene became a key figure, a kind of prototypical figure, especially representing the female Christian.
She takes on the role of representing women in general versus men in general. And the disciples, who are the men, sometimes try to reject her from their company, and she stands up for herself and, by implication, women. But the representative of the men who says no to her generally is Peter.
Mary's relationship with Peter came to symbolize this conflict.
There's this sort of wealth of early Christian writings in which the tension between Peter and Mary is quite apparent. And you see this not only in the Gospels that are now in the New Testament, but you see it in a whole range of early Christian sources which do not find their way into the New Testament.
As Peter and the ideas he stood for became dominant in the growing movement, so Mary's role as an important disciple was undermined. And as the church became more institutionalized, women leaders were squeezed out.
What happens to that Mary? Well, she must be the victim of the power struggle, must be a victim of the way history gets written. And who writes history? Men write history.
By the time we get into the 4th and 5th century, simply for women to exercise public leadership is itself heretical. So women cannot be ordained, for example, to become a bishop or a priest and so forth. And from that perspective, Mary Magdalene becomes a real problem because she can be used to validate women's leadership in the church.
This was an image of Mary that wasn't popular with leaders of the growing church in Rome. Mary Magdalene was about to meet her downfall. The church wanted to limit religious doctrine to the Bible, so it had to stamp out unorthodox ideas. Obviously, the Nag Hammadi books and the Gospel of Mary were part of the problem, so the books disappeared.
We have to imagine, here are people in the 4th century who have books containing these works. The church officials are now saying, don't read those, don't own them. What do you do with them? Well, perhaps you throw them away or you burn them. Or perhaps you say, I'm going to hide these away somewhere and maybe go back later and get them. And if you don't go back later and get them, they lie there in the desert.
But hiding the books did not bury Mary Magdalene. She couldn't be removed from the stories of Jesus altogether, because she already existed as one of his followers in the 4 Gospels. So another role had to be found for her.
What was needed was an alternative story for Mary Magdalene. So what we see is the invention of the story of Mary as a prostitute. And I don't think this was innocent.
In fact, a close examination of the Bible reveals a startling truth.
The case of Mary Magdalene becoming known as the most famous prostitute in the world has to do with a certain reading of the Gospels.
There are many women named Mary in the Gospels, and unfortunately for Mary Magdalene, she was one of them. This made it possible to recast her wrongly as the fallen woman so familiar to us.
What we see happening is that the woman who anointed Jesus in Luke 7, who's called the sinner, she anoints Jesus with a perfume and dries his feet with her hair, and she weeps. This Mary is then associated with Mary in the Gospel of John, who is the sister of Martha, who anoints Jesus for his burial. Now, this Mary is then confused with Mary Magdalene, so that Mary Magdalene becomes the sinner woman who anointed Jesus. And from this, it's only one quick step to identifying Mary Magdalene with every unnamed sinner woman in the Gospels.
So the question is, if she's a woman, what kind of sinner would she be? And they decided that she was a prostitute because this is the typical sin that a woman would commit.
One of the ways in which you can insult a woman leader is basically by linking her with improper sexuality and prostitution.
Mary's transformation from apostle to sinner and then to penitent was underway.
And by the 6th century, Pope Gregory the Great can, in a sermon, deliver what is really the moral outcome of this point of view.
At the Basilica San Clemente, the Pope declared that Mary's original 7 demons had signified all the vices, but then she had repented and turned the mass of her crimes to virtues.
So Mary Magdalene, the apostolic leader, becomes Mary Magdalene, the repentant prostitute.
Mary Magdalene now had a new role. The growing church was encouraging converts to the faith to reflect on their own sinful pasts, and this new Mary was the ideal role model.
She became a very important figure because she could be used to show that women needed to repent, that women's sin was sexual, and she could be then contrasted with the Virgin Mother. And they become, along with Eve, the basis for understanding women and women's sexuality in the West.
In her role as a penitent, Mary Magdalene still had many faithful supporters. But unfortunately, her reinvention as a sinner left a stain on her name.
Claiming that she is a prostitute is just not ever a positive statement, even in a tradition which sees penitence as very important and sees repenting of one's sins as the thing that all human beings should do.
The Catholic Church did declare a saint's day in Mary's name and dedicated churches to her, but she was a saint who stood for repentance. Perhaps it's time to review Mary's legacy.
We should remember her not only as a follower of Jesus and someone who had a vision of Jesus, but also someone who was quite likely a leader in the early Christian movement. And I think, too, we should remember the story of how she was made into a prostitute, because that story has lessons for us in many, many ways. But it's not her.
I think we should view her as having played a very prominent role in this Jesus movement. Consider that she is the witness to the crucifixion and the resurrection. She and other women were there from the beginning. Consider that she is later such an important counter figure to Peter. We have to imagine that she was every bit as important as those 12.
Mary Magdalene may once have been as significant as the other apostles, but she has never taken her rightful place alongside them, nor, as some experts believe, been given the full credit she deserves.
Mary Magdalene is an extremely remarkable woman because it is she who, in my opinion, single-handedly brought to light and brought about Christianity.
In 1969, the Catholic Church acknowledged that Mary Magdalene had been wronged. They withdrew the label penitent from her saint's day, but many of us still only know her as the prostitute. The campaign against Mary Magdalene goes back so many centuries, it's hard to reclaim the truth. But perhaps one day this extraordinary woman will be recognized for what she really was, one of the founders of the Christian faith.